Hey, I'm Chris from Make Everything, and today we're making a serrated knife with a leather sheath. Check it out. So this knife design was something that I had sketched up on my iPad, and this is made for a friend of mine. It's actually a gift for a friend of his, and the knife was designed to sort of fit in the person's hand specifically, and I just kind of sketched something up roughly and then printed it out. I trace it onto that CPM 154 steel after cutting out the template, and now I'm just cutting it out on the porter band. And the blade I was using was pretty rough, and the CPM 154 steel, which is a stainless steel, it can be a little tough even when it's annealed, so I was kind of having a hard time pushing the blade through this. After I was done cutting this, I switched out to a fresh blade. When my bandsaw blades get this dull, sometimes I like to just force them through the cuts so that I don't dull out the new blade. And now that that's done, I just head over to the grinder and I refine the shape a little bit. I don't go too crazy here. I just try to get it closer to the line so I get an idea of the shape. And I switch out the flat platen for a small wheel attachment so I can get into that finger groove a little bit better. And here I'm using an 80 grit ceramic. And I use this little die grinder to grind out the sharpening choil. Now, something I've been trying to force myself to do lately is flatten my blades. Something I never used to do. I never really cared about it, but having a surface grinder and having the capability to do it, I figured it's good practice just to make sure my blades are nice and flat before I heat treat them so that everything stays nice and parallel and you get a nice consistent surface finish. So I'm still getting the hang of my surface grinder, but for now I'm just grinding everything nice and flat. You'll see I left out a little spot on the tip, but that'll get ground away anyway. And I'm just tracing out where the handle scales are going to be and throwing in where the pins are going to be and punching those holes. And now I'm over on the drill press just drilling those holes out to 1/8 of an inch, which is the 1/8 inch brass pins I'm going to use. The bottom hole is going to be 1/4 inch, and that I'll drill with an 8 inch at first, and then I'll chase it with a 1/4 inch drill bit, and that's going to be for the lanyard loop. And I just deburr all the holes and trace the pattern onto the scales. And these scales came from Rob's Wildwood. They're stabilized and dyed. They're really beautiful. I'm really happy to have found Rob's Wildwood. He makes great scales and they're really nice. And I rough cut the profile and then I split them on the bandsaw. And now I use a more specialized resawing blade, but it does a really nice job of splitting the scales. And I actually sort of went out of order here. I should have drilled the holes through the knife blank into the scales before I split them. But now I just clamp everything to the blank and I chase through the holes with the drill bit and get those pin holes nice and lined up through the scales. And once everything's unclamped, I just do a quick test fit and I make sure that everything's going to look nice when it's set up. And something I always have to remind myself to do is put my maker's mark in the blade. Not using a heavy duty punch that I got from McMaster, I just stamp it in on the anvil. So the tin foil that I'm using here is a stainless steel heat treating foil, and since this is a stainless that has to be treated inside a foil packet that's airtight, I bend everything over and I crimp and hammer the seams to make sure everything stays nice and airtight for the heat treating process.
One eternity later.
And now the knife's nice and hard, only 4 hours later. I head back over to the grinder and just continue to refine the shape. Now that everything's hardened, the work that I'm doing will be final and I don't have to think about then removing any more scale. So I'm going to mark my edge center and I lay it out with layout fluid, and then I use this height gauge to get a nice center line scribed in the layout fluid. Now for grinding my bevels, I always like to mark where my scales end, and then I put my little bevel grinding jig on there, and that just keeps my plunge lines consistent. It's just two pieces of flat stock screwed together, clamped to the blade. And I'm using an 80 grit ceramic belt here. This is a shredder belt, and just laying out my bevels. Now, as I've said before in my other knife making video, I'm not the greatest at grinding bevels. Every time I make a knife, it's sort of a learning experience for me. So I encourage you to look up some information if you're interested in knife making and bevel grinding. Walter Sorrells has a lot of great information, as well as Ecom Knives, and there's a couple other guys out there, but practice makes perfect when it comes to grinding knife bevels, and I'm certainly not an expert, but I'm getting better with every knife I make. Now, the biggest thing for me is just keeping everything nice and consistent and keeping your body tuned into the grinder so that you don't go too deep or too shallow and mess your grinds up. So I'm quenching in between pretty much every pass just because this blade's pretty thin. It gets nice and hot, and I don't want to ruin the temper because this blade, as you know, has already been heat treated and tempered. This grind will be final once I'm done with it, and it won't be easy to clean up if I make a big mistake. So I rough everything in with the 80 grit, and as it's coming along, I'm just constantly checking, making sure everything looks nice and even. Now after the 80 grit, I switch over to a 120 grit. And this happens to be a J-Flex belt, is what I have at the time, and I like the way these finish up. And they've been lasting pretty good for me. And I'm over on the flat platen, obviously, and this grinder is a LB1000 from Wilmot Grinders. Once my bevels are ground, I pop that jig off, and I just kind of refine my handle scales a little bit. With handle scales, you have to finish the top of the scales completely before you glue them to the knife, because once they're on the knife, you can't get there. So just sort of refining that stuff and making sure it's good. And now I'm just cutting my pins to length. I like to set up a little stop block just with a clamp to make sure my pins are all the same length. Saves a little bit of time later. Just doing a test fit with the pins. See how everything fits up. Make sure that all the pins are going to drive through. And now I'll go through and knock those pins back out and just finish the top of those scales, along with finishing the edge of the blade. So after heat treat, there's some marks from the heat. It gets a little discolored. So now I just refine everything using the Scotch-Brite belt and using the 120 grit sanding belt that I was using earlier. The Scotch-Brite belt gives a nice even finish, and here I'm just sort of grinding the flats, trying to get everything nice and consistent. And then once I run over everything with the Scotch-Brite, it gives a nice consistent sort of grind pattern. It's almost like a satin. I'm not going too crazy with the finish. I'm just trying to get it, this is a utility knife. I'm trying to get it so that it looks nice and even and not too flashy. So something specific about this knife that was requested was that it was serrated. And I'd never made a serrated knife before, so I kind of just winged it. I laid out the serrations with the caliper, and now I'm just grinding them in with actually a chainsaw sharpening bit for the Dremel. And I'm just doing this by eye. I'm doing my best to sort of keep the serrations even and symmetrical, and I'm just sort of working that angle as I go by. And I'm looking at the knife through a magnifying light, so I have a pretty good idea of what I'm doing while I'm doing it. But it was definitely a little bit of a nerve-wracking process, considering the blade was almost finished at this point before I started grinding in these big removed chunks. So once I ground those serrations in, I did a regrind on the back side, and what it did was it exposed the sharp points of the serrations. And they actually worked out really nice. They came out nice and sharp, and they definitely work really well. The person that's using this knife will be using it for florist type activities, so that serrated edge will be nice for cutting branches and leaves and stuff. You can see the finish that the Scotch-Brite leaves. So now that I'm ready to glue the handle scales, I just want to make sure that I finish the top edge. And by finishing the top edge, I'm just making sure that everything's nice and smooth and rounded over, so that once these are glued on, I won't have any need to touch up the top edges again, because I won't really be able to get to them. And I'm using the G5 epoxy, which sets up pretty quickly but gives a nice good hold. I'll give these all night to dry, and I'll clamp them really well just to make sure everything sets up really tight. And before I glued these scales onto the blank, I made sure that I roughed them up with some 80 grit sandpaper so that the glue would have somewhere to sit. If your scales are like glass smooth, sometimes it's hard for the epoxy to grab into that, and they'll shift a little bit. And you clamp those up really tight and let this sit overnight. Another big thing is to clean up any epoxy that squeezes out, and I just use acetone and a Q-tip for this. So now the epoxy is dry, it's the next day. Pop the clamps off, and usually the clamps get glued on, so I just knock them off with a hammer. And I'll cut the pins down on the bandsaw so I don't have to grind too much of it away. Head over to the grinder, and this is that 80 grit aluminum oxide belt, and I'm just rough grinding all the sides of the scales down so they're nice and even. And I got my dust collector set up so that I'm not breathing in too much of this stabilized wood. Just grinding everything down until I start to hit the blank and start to hit the actual metal of the knife. That's how I know that I've got the scales down to the right size, and just checking the thickness as I go as well. And on the small wheel, I'll be able to get into that finger spot and just sort of push the material away. And then to refine it all, I'll move to a 120 grit J-flex, and you can see how I'm rocking the knife now, getting sort of finger grooves in there, making it a little more comfortable in the hand, just sort of smoothing everything out as I go. And I'm being very careful, obviously, not to hit my edge. It's really easy to make a mistake at this point. I have this little kind of custom vise that I made. I just took a multi-position vise and a woodworker's clamp and bolted it on there. And it's good for kind of doing knife scales, and you can get the knife and the handle in a position that's comfortable for you to sand, and just, you know, smooth everything out and refine it, get the feel that you want in your hand. It's a nice little knife with a thin handle, so it's very comfortable and sleek to hold. I clean off the wood with some acetone, and then I'll apply some clear mineral oil to it, and that'll kind of be the finish on it. But once this mineral oil dries, I like to buff it as well, so I'll go over to the buffer and I'll use some white compound on a loose buffing wheel, and I'll just buff it in there, and pretty quickly you get a really nice sheen, and it sort of seals up the pores in the scales, and it makes them look really nice and slick and finished. And I'm being mindful not to hit the actual blade, because I don't want to buff the blade. I want to leave it satin. I just want to buff the scales. So the knife is essentially done at this point, and it's time to make a sheath. For my sheaths, I usually just lay them out on paper, I trace the knife, and I have an idea in my head of what I want, so I just sort of freewheel it. You know, I have a lot of templates for knife shapes, but I have almost no templates for sheaths. I just like to figure them out when the knife is done. So fitting this sheath on this particular piece of leather was a little bit difficult, but it's no big deal. You just sort of use the shape that the material is, and you kind of adapt to it. So this sheath is going to have a loop for a belt and a button to keep the knife in. And I like this sort of textured leather that I have. I test fit everything with clamps, just make sure everything will fit. And then I grab some leather glue after punching a couple of the holes, and I glue the sheath closed and clamp it up and give it a little while to dry. Once that's all dry, I'll do the same for where the belt loop is going to be. After just doing a little bit of trimming, now I'll fold the belt loop over and give it some glue, clamp it up, and give it some time to dry before I move any further. Giving the glue some time to dry just makes it a little bit easier when you're punching for the thread holes later on. I lay out that sort of inset with the caliper, and then I actually like to draw it in pencil. I punch my start and stop holes, and then I run my prong punch for my thread to run through. I have this little vise from Harbor Freight. It's great for leather work. It's kind of a multi-position vise. It's good for a little bit of everything. It's a nice vise to keep on the bench. And I'm threading some wax thread through it in both directions, just making sure everything stays nice and tight and even. And I like to punch that start and stop hole because it gives me somewhere to tie off, and then I add a rivet and that locks the thread in so that, you know, it's really firm in there. Plus with the glue inside the sheath, if it ever does get cut, the glue is bonded the leather to itself, so it's hard for it to ever really come apart. Now I'm adding the snaps. I like to make my snaps really tight because they will stretch out over time, and I want to make sure that the knife never gets loose in there and falls out on its own. Something else that's always important to do when you add a snap is to put a little piece of leather on the inside of the sheath so you don't scratch the knife up every time you take it in and out. And now I'm just adding a little bit of thread to where the belt loop is. I punched those holes and just ran the thread through it just the same as I did the other side, except there'll be no rivet on this side. So I'll just hide a knot inside one of the prongs that I cut out, and I'll make sure that it's on the back side so it's not noticeable. I'm burnishing the leather here using a white oak round that I made and I have running on the buffer, and it just cleans up the edge really nice. It spins pretty high RPM, and then I finish the edges with some edge coat. And the edge coat just keeps the leather from fraying and it gives it a nice little contrasting look. I use a brown edge coat, and I don't like to put any finish on the actual leather. Just let it be natural and let it weather as it will. Now that's all done, I just give the knife its final sharpening. This is a 1000 grit belt, and then I move over to a 9 micron belt, and then over to a leather strop. And at that point the knife's shave sharp. The final thing to do is to add this little leather loop on the back side. So I just take a little leather lace, run it around, put some glue and one little loop of some thread, tie it off, and we're ready to go. Now it's time for some glory shots of this thing. I'm really happy with how this little knife came out. Like I said, it was my first serrated knife, and I think for its practical use, it's going to last a really long time. I'm Chris Zepp from Make Everything. Thanks for watching. If you want more information about knife making or more information about any of the process that I did throughout this video, leave a comment down below. If you want a sweet Make Everything t-shirt, check the link in the description. If you're interested in behind the scenes stuff at the shop, follow us on Instagram at Make Everything Shop. And if you're local to the Long Island, New York area, we also teach classes here. So I encourage you to take a look at the link in the description and see what we're offering this fall. Again, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next video.